Hey guys, my name is JAde and welcome to Dallas Jamming. In this video, I wanted to talk about the main differences between the Roland SP-404 and the Elektron Octatrack. Specifically, the latest SP-404, so the SP-404A and X, and the Octatrack MK2. So right off the bat, we see a very big price difference between these two devices, and then that might make you wonder, why would these even be considered like comparable? They're both samplers, which means sound can be recorded into them, and they're also both effects processors. The Elektron Octatrack can do a lot more, like sequencing MIDI, trick conditions. It also has two stereo inputs, which means that you can run up to 4 instruments in mono in it, and we get the also famous Elektron sequencer and workflow. So one of the cool things about the Elektron workflow is that once you know one machine, you pretty much know all of them, except the Octatrack. The Octatrack is like the black sheep of the family. Although we get that beautiful Elektron workflow, the Octatrack works with something called parts and machines, so just because you know how to use the Elektron Analog 4 doesn't mean you're easily going to be able to just pick up the Octatrack and know it right away. But this should work the other way around, because once you know the Octatrack, that's like the highest point of Elektron education that you can get. So anything after that, like the digitone or the cycles, that's just gonna come super easy. So a brand new Octatrack is gonna cost you $14.99. You can find them used for around like $1,200, $1,300 sometimes. I'm talking about the MK2. The MK1s are a lot cheaper, and they're actually not that much different. The MK2s have better buttons, a more beautiful aesthetic, and they also have better labeling. A brand new SP-404 is gonna run you $550, although I recommend that you definitely look for those used, because you can find SP-404 SXs, which are like the second one. So there's the SP-404, which is the original OG that is like famous for that vinyl sim. Then you have the SP-404 SX. The main difference between that one and the original is that that one comes with an SD card slot instead of like the bigger card slots, so it reads a lot faster. Then the latest one is the SP-404A, which I haven't tried at all, but it's exactly the same thing as the SP-404 SX, except with like different colored pads and a new paint job. I haven't heard of any other differences between that, so I got the SX because it was a lot cheaper. I think I got it for like $350 around like 2-3 years ago. You can find the SP-404 SX and the A for around like $350 to like $450, depending like how lucky you get. So there is a really big price difference between the two. But does that necessarily mean that the Octatrack is better than the SP-404? I will say this, I consider like the Octatrack more like a production tool and the SP-404 more of an instrument, and I'm gonna tell you why. The SP-404 doesn't have a screen, so that means that it requires a lot of like muscle memory, pressing button combinations that you need to remember, and like once you do those a million times, you're just gonna like do them automatically. You're not even gonna think about it. With the Octatrack, it takes a lot more setting up, and I mean like even just setting up the inputs. Like you can't just like plug in something and put it into the inputs and then like hear it right away. Like you have to go in, turn the volume of the certain input, choose the input. Like there's a lot more pre-set up, and you also have to remember this is per project. So like unless you're working with a template and like you have it all nicely set up for every time that you load it in, which I highly recommend, but at first like when you get a device, it's like I recommend that you start over every single time, because that like helps your brain like make the pathways that it needs to like learn that device. Does that make any sense? A good example would be like with my modular. When I first got it, even still, I always unpatch it. Like, I'll make my patching and then at the end I unpatch it. That way, when I start over again, especially when you're learning something new, you're coming from like, okay, this is where I start, now this is where I go next. But if you're not working with a template, you're gonna have to set these things up every time. And that goes with everything, like setting up the MIDI channels. Even though it should just be like 1 through 8 automatically, you have to go and set them in manually. Yes, I understand that like this gives it a lot more flexibility to do things, but again, when you're just trying to get ideas out, that's why I consider the Octatrack more of a production tool and the SP more of an instrument. Also, chopping samples on the SP-404 is such a pleasure. I love chopping samples on the SP-404. I love finger drumming and just like the vibe that it gives you. But I will say this, editing samples on the SP-404 is a pain in the butt. That is because, again, we don't have a screen, so we don't have a visual representation of like our WAV file. So in order to trim a sample, most of the time you have to listen through the whole sample, then find the right start and end points and kind of like trim them slowly, press end, go back, press end. Like it's very tedious to edit samples on the SP-404 to get them like precisely, because yes, you could go and listen to the sample and then like chop it up, but to get those really precise beginnings, it's gonna take a lot more work than something on like the Octatrack, where like you can zoom in with the tiniest percentage and have it like precisely where you want it to be. Another cool thing about the Octatrack is the amazing sequencer. Like I said, you have 16 steps that can be completely individual of like tuning, direction, length, like There's so much that you can do with the Octatrack. It really is a sample mangler. It can take a sample and turn it into something like completely different that you're like, whoa, what even is this? Like, I don't even know what this is, but it sounds awesome because with the sequencer and the trick conditions, like the Octatrack is king when it comes to like sample mangling. When it comes to just an instrument and having fun with it, I think the SP-404 is more hands-on. Like I said, not per function. You don't really have to think about what you're doing after you've mastered it. You also have to keep into consideration the sample time because yes, although you do have that SD card in the back of the Octatrack, there is like a sample limit per project. On the SP-404, you pretty much get 120 sample slots that you have instant access to because you have A, B, and then you have 5, and then you have 12 pads. So that is a lot of samples that can be held into this thing. I've never ran into like any low memory problems or that I can't continue the project because of low memory. Never had that issue on the SP-404. On the Octatrack and many other devices, sample time can be an issue, and it doesn't even matter like how big your memory card is because that sample time is running from the internal like memory. The SP-404 is also battery powered, which means it's a lot more portable. And honestly, I feel like a lot safer, like taking out a $300 to $400 piece of gear, like to a show, than like a $1,400 piece of gear. That's the other thing that really like drew me to the SP-404, that it's like, okay, I can mess this thing up, I can put stickers on it, I can do whatever, you know, like it's not gonna be like that much of a loss as like getting the Octatrack wet or something. So the way that these devices interact with how they mangle effects are different as well. With the Octatrack, we're dependent on like the little slider, which can be a lot of fun, but you have to remember, you have to set all of those parameters and positions of each specific step to tell it to do what you want it to do. With the SP-404, the effects are already there and they sound really good. If you ask me, the effects on the SP-404 are a lot better than on the Octatrack. The reverb is luscious, the vinyl sim. The Octatrack has plenty of effects as well, the most popular being the delay and the reverb. And even then, like they take a lot of tweaking to get them to sound even close to something like the SP-404. Another thing that these two machines have in common is the note repeat. On the Octatrack, it sounds something like this. And on the SP-404, it sounds something like this.
あんまりわけのわかんないことを
育児なし、卑怯者、女ったらし、浮気者、最低男。
わけぐらい聞いてください。
So if I had to describe what I'm hearing or like what's happening to the sounds, I think the Elektron one sounds like a bit more like electronic, glitchy type. And then the SP-404, it really focuses on like that bass drum and really fits like those lo-fi, gritty type beats that you hear people make with the SP-404. These two effects are sinfully overused, especially on the SP-404, myself included, but doing this is just so much fun. Like it is just so much fun to have control over the beat repeat on the SP-404, where like you're literally timing it as you're moving the knob and you already know what it's gonna do. With the Octatrack, yes, you can do similar things as well, but just to do this simple thing like requires so much setting up. When I first got into Elektron gear, Cuckoo was like my source of all things Elektron tutorials, and he even has a tutorial of like where to set this up, and it is quite lengthy, and I just didn't really understand like why I had to do all of this just so I could do that. And that's one of the main things that brought me closer to the SP-404, because no, it's not as powerful, no, it doesn't have the crazy sample mangling capabilities that the Octatrack has. But when it comes to usability, having a device feel more like an instrument and a part of you instead of like something that you're programming and hoping that it's gonna sound good after you're done programming it, it really takes it away from like instrument category, more like music production tool category. So one of my favorite features when I did have the Octatrack was the sequencer. Like, I love the Elektron sequencer, especially because of trig conditions. If you don't know what trig conditions are, it pretty much means that every step has like a mind of its own. So like, if I wanted to just play 2 times during one bar, then I'll do that. It's an awesome sequencer, and it's great for like giving your tracks like those experimental shots that you wouldn't really think of adding. And that was one of my favorite parts about the Octatrack. When I got into the Octatrack, the Digitact wasn't even out yet, so there's so many more options to get that Elektron sequencer. Not being the Octatrack, even now like the Analog Rhythm and Analog 4 can sequence other gear. You do sacrifice like the internal tracks, but you know, you can use it as a sequencer if you want. When it comes to a device that I'm just gonna like load my tracks into, because that's sometimes normally what I do with my 404, like I'll work on my tracks elsewhere. Why am I moving my hands so much? Like I'll work on my tracks somewhere else, like for example on the Machine Plus or on my montage, and then once I have that track finished, I'll bring it into my SP-404. Sometimes I'll play it straight ahead and just add effects to it, or sometimes I'll take that track further and chop up like the melodies on the SP-404 and then add drums and like come up with something completely different. So like there's a lot of ways to use the SP. Just because you can't do the same things that you can on the Octatrack doesn't necessarily mean that it should be valued any less. Like we've seen awesome artists do amazing things on both of these devices. For example, and it's really easy at the beginning to watch these videos and be like, wow, I need that because I'm gonna be able to do that. But the reality is that these people have spent years mastering these devices. So it's really what you dedicate your time into, what you master, and what you can be like you're most comfortable in, to get to a point where you're comfortable enough on a piece of gear where you don't even have to think about what you're doing. You're just feeling it, you're just jamming. Like that is the goal, and that should be your goal. That's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was informative to you and helping you decide which weapon to go with. If you want to find out more about making music without a computer, check out my Dallas guide at dallasjamming.com. If you would like to support this channel in any way, consider becoming a patron or checking out my sample and sound packs and my dope synthesizer shirts. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.